They told you the world is shaped by circumstances. And what if I tell you that everything you see, touch, and feel is born from your imagination? And I will reveal how this hidden power is already within you, waiting to be awakened. I will reveal how belief can rewrite reality itself. And I will reveal the secret that those who master this art move mountains without ever leaving their minds. And they told you that some dreams are impossible. Yet Neville walked through life proving otherwise, shaping each moment with an invisible hand that only he could see. This is how it unfolds. Neville began his journey on the small island of Barbados, where the horizon felt both vast and limiting. This is where the illusion deepens. As a young boy, he noticed the disparity between what was and what could be, igniting a spark of imagination that would define his existence. This is why it matters. Because even in humble beginnings, Neville demonstrated that the mind is the seed of destiny. This is the turning point. When he decided that relocation to New York would not be a gamble but a certainty envisioned in his mind, this is how freedom announces itself. By seeing yourself in a reality that doesn't yet exist. Neville walked with conviction into unseen opportunities. This is why circumstances lose power. When the inner world is cultivated with purpose and clarity, this is how destiny is rewritten. Every step he took was preceded by nights of deliberate imagination, shaping the streets, the people, and the prospects he would encounter. This is where belief transforms. He would imagine conversations, positions, and doors opening as if they were already real. This is how the impossible becomes ordinary, by living within the sensation of fulfillment before the external world confirms it. This is why the mind is sovereign. For Neville, the physical world was a mirror reflecting the inner narrative he authored. This is how time bends. He would envision days, months, and years as pliable clay, molded by the certainty of imagined triumph. This is where courage is born. Embracing the invisible path allowed him to walk unshaken through the uncertainties of youth. This is how the unseen whispers or insight from mentors and books became fuel for his conscious creation. This is why awareness is power. Recognizing that imagination precedes manifestation became his guiding principle. This is how preparation meets opportunity. Neville's mind rehearsed realities that would later appear as undeniable facts. This is why persistence is invisible. Repeated mental living in the end ensured that no circumstance could overrule his imagination. This is how influence radiates. By the time he stepped into public teaching, he had already manifested a life that inspired others without uttering a word. This is where legacy begins. The seeds of Neville's personal manifestations would eventually grow into lessons taught worldwide. This is why attention must be deliberate. Every focus, feeling, and thought was a sculptor's tool shaping destiny. This is how the extraordinary emerges, by understanding that your inner world is the womb of all external realities. Can you imagine a young boy staring out at the Caribbean Sea, dreaming of lands far beyond the horizon, not yet knowing that his imagination was the map that would one day carry him there, and yet feeling deep within that his mind held the key to every locked door he would face? This is how it begins. Neville Goddard's early life in Barbados was not adorned with luxury, but with quiet conviction and boundless curiosity that refused to accept limitation. This is where wonder awakens. He often gazed at ships in the harbor, imagining himself aboard, traveling to distant places he had never seen but felt intimately within. This is how vision takes root. While others saw barriers of circumstance, Neville saw invisible bridges connecting him to infinite possibilities. This is where the dream expands. As a child, he would close his eyes and live entire lifetimes in imagination, feeling what it meant to walk the streets of New York long before he ever left the island. This is how longing transforms. He understood that desire was not emptiness, but the evidence of something already existing in an unseen dimension. This is where intention sharpens. Neville began experimenting with his inner world, noticing that when he felt something vividly, coincidences began aligning in mysterious ways. This is how inner certainty grows. Every visualization brought small yet meaningful shifts, confirming to him that imagination was not fantasy, but the first stage of manifestation. This is where faith matures. Though his surroundings remained simple, his consciousness became rich, vibrant, and unstoppable. This is how the unseen responds. Events began arranging themselves around his convictions as if the world were listening to his silent affirmations. This is where belief solidifies. He learned that the universe is not indifferent, but obedient to the tone of one's inner speech. This is how the dreamer awakens. He discovered that creation is finished and that all potential realities already exist, awaiting human recognition. This is where courage is tested. When faced with doubt, he returned inward, knowing that nothing external could overpower a well-fed vision. This is how divine timing reveals itself. Each imagined step toward New York seemed to magnetically pull opportunities toward him. This is where self-awareness crystallizes. He began to see himself as the cause, not the effect, of every unfolding circumstance. This is how gratitude amplifies creation. He learned to thank the unseen before the seen appeared, living in a constant atmosphere of fulfillment. This is where mastery takes its first breath. As Neville's inner world became richer than his outer, he realized that material change was only a reflection of internal transformation. This is how energy rearranges form. Through unwavering inner focus, he began manifesting coincidences that dissolved impossibility. This is where purpose ignites. His childhood dreams were not mere wishes. They were rehearsals of destiny, performed in the theater of imagination. This is how the ordinary is transcended, because even in his youth, Neville was already proving that imagination, not circumstance, writes the script of one's life. Picture for a moment a young Neville stepping onto the deck of a ship bound for New York, the salt wind whipping against his face as the island of his childhood faded into a mist behind him, and the unshakable conviction of unseen certainty guiding every heartbeat forward. This is how destiny calls. He didn't merely buy a ticket. He aligned his inner world with the image of arrival, rehearsing the feeling of walking down New York streets long before the ship reached its shore. This is where faith becomes motion. The journey across the ocean wasn't just physical but symbolic, a movement from doubt to divine assurance. This is how the unseen guides the seen. As he stood beneath the endless sky, he knew that imagination had already gone ahead, preparing every encounter waiting in that new world. This is where the bridge of incidents forms. Neville didn't worry about the how, for he understood that when the state is assumed, the universe constructs the path in perfect precision. This is how surrender becomes strength. He trusted his imaginal act more than the evidence of his senses, and in doing so, carried the atmosphere of New York within him before he even arrived. This is where miracles disguise themselves as coincidences. He met the right people, found lodging, and began work in unexpected ways that all felt naturally inevitable. This is how energy organizes destiny. By living as though he already belonged in the city, he magnetized circumstances that recognized his assumption. This is where persistence meets proof. Every closed door eventually yielded to the quiet confidence of one who already possessed what he sought. This is how self-concept reshapes matter. Neville learned that to change your world, you must first change the feeling of I am that animates your world. This is where the law of assumption breathes. He realized that everything in life mirrors one's dominant inner state, no exception given. This is how divine order hides in daily details. The job offers, friendships and mentors that appeared were not luck, but reflections of imaginal commitment. This is where courage takes form. For Neville, each challenge was a test of faith, an invitation to remain steadfast in his chosen vision. This is how consciousness reveals its authority. Even when faced with scarcity or uncertainty, he refused to mentally leave the state of fulfillment. This is where mastery over the senses begins. He learned to discipline imagination, feeling wealth, stability, and belonging even when evidence contradicted them. This is how the mind bends the world. By refusing to see obstacles as final, he turned resistance into reassurance that his manifestation was near completion. This is where understanding deepens. Neville began teaching himself that every event, pleasant or harsh, was simply movement toward the fulfillment of assumption. This is how peace settles into power. His trust in imagination became a silent fortress amidst chaos, and the city that once seemed overwhelming now felt like a stage built for his unfolding story. This is where manifestation becomes natural. New York no longer felt like something achieved but something remembered from within. This is how the law proves itself. By the time Neville found his footing, he had not only manifested a new life, but demonstrated that consciousness alone is the architect of all reality. Now consider this. The young Neville, walking through the bustling streets of New York, surrounded by the noise of ambition and uncertainty, carrying within him the power of imagination that would soon turn the mundane act of selling into a classroom for creation itself. This is how it begins to unfold. He took a job as a salesman, not because it was his dream, but because it was a stage where he could test the unseen law he had begun to trust. This is where ordinary life becomes mystical. Each potential customer became an opportunity to prove that consciousness, not persuasion, determines outcome. This is how energy precedes action. Neville didn't focus on convincing others, but on assuming the feeling that every sale was already complete. This is where the illusion of effort dissolves. He found that when he imagined success as already real, clients responded with uncanny ease. This is how the invisible hand works. The numbers he once struggled to meet began to rise without added strain, because his inner state had already fulfilled them. This is where cause and effect merge into one. Neville realized that the world is not responding to words or strategies, but to the vibration of one's inner conviction. This is how mastery is tested. He began using his daily work as spiritual practice, turning each transaction into an exercise in faith. This is where imagination becomes currency. He discovered that to feel abundance was to invite it, regardless of current balance or circumstance. This is how emotion shapes matter. Neville understood that feeling was the bridge between the unseen idea and its physical counterpart. This is where awareness sharpens. He trained himself to notice when doubt crept in and instantly replaced it with the tone of certainty. This is how miracles masquerade as routine, while others called his success luck. Neville recognized it as the predictable outcome of an assumed state. This is where confidence becomes creation. Every morning he rehearsed the end result. Every evening he felt gratitude for what his imagination had already produced. This is how self-image becomes fate. He stopped identifying as a struggling worker and began to see himself as a channel of abundance and influence. This is where understanding transforms into demonstration. Neville's results became living proof that inner assumption always precedes outer manifestation. This is how repetition carves reality. His continual practice of inner visualization deepened the neural and spiritual pattern of certainty. This is where the unseen becomes practical. He showed that spiritual law doesn't only apply to lofty ideals, but to daily bread and opportunity alike. This is how the outer world bends to inner command. By assuming the end, he stopped chasing outcomes and began attracting them. This is where faith takes its rightful throne. Neville's life as a salesman became a revelation that belief persistently held is the only true profession of humankind. This is how destiny evolves from discipline. Every sale, every encounter, every outcome became a verse in the unfolding scripture of his awakening, reminding him that the mind that imagines is the mind that rules. Suppose you discover that at the exact moment when doubt begins to cloud your journey, life sends a teacher who speaks the language your soul has been whispering all along, and that this meeting is not coincidence, but the inevitable response to your unspoken readiness. This is how fate arranges its characters. Neville met Abdullah, a mysterious Ethiopian mystic, at a time when he had questions that no conventional answer could satisfy. This is where the true lesson begins. Abdullah did not teach him to seek but to be, insisting that the assumption of the wish fulfilled is the only bridge to manifestation. This is how wisdom hides in simplicity. Abdullah told Neville to stop asking how things will happen and start living as if they already have. This is where the law becomes living. The mentor's instructions were not theories but direct commands to occupy the state of the end. This is how resistance begins to crumble. Neville learned that imagination is not fantasy, but creation in motion, waiting for the senses to catch up. This is where discipline deepens. Abdullah would not allow him to speak words of doubt, reminding him that every declaration is a seed cast into the field of consciousness. This is how transformation tests obedience. Neville struggled at first to remain faithful to unseen realities, yet Abdullah's unwavering confidence became a mirror to his potential. This is where the invisible classroom unfolds. Their conversations went beyond religion or philosophy. They were practical lessons in spiritual physics. This is how belief becomes law. Abdullah made him understand that every assumption, whether noble or trivial, is destiny in rehearsal. This is where the law of being reveals its beauty. To imagine is to claim, to feel is to create, to persist is to guarantee. This is how the unseen becomes a friend. Neville began seeing his mentor not just as a teacher, but as a reflection of the awakened mind. This is where humility meets revelation. He realized that guidance only appears when the student is ready to dissolve the ego's need for proof. This is how trust turns to evidence. Neville started applying Abdullah's teachings, beginning with small, deliberate acts of imagination that soon reshaped his external world. This is where understanding becomes embodiment. When Abdullah told him he was already in Barbados, Neville was forced to live that truth mentally until life conspired to make it literal. This is how manifestation proves its certainty. Within weeks, the impossible journey was arranged without Neville lifting a finger in worry. This is where divine law smiles. The universe responded precisely because he stopped seeking and started being. This is how mentorship refines mastery. Through Abdullah, Neville learned that imagination disciplined by feeling is omnipotence in human form. This is where gratitude evolves into realization. By the time their lessons concluded, Neville no longer saw life as random, but as deliberate expression. And this is how destiny fulfills its promise. The meeting with Abdullah was not a chapter in his story. It was the ignition of the fire that would light every teaching he would ever give. Envision a world where a man who once sold goods on crowded streets now sits by lamplight with a pen in hand, translating invisible truths into words that would echo through generations, long after his own voice was gone, his room filled with the stillness of creation itself. This is how inspiration becomes immortal. Neville began to write not for fame, but to crystallize the laws that had transformed his own life, knowing that the written word could carry imagination's vibration across time. This is where thought becomes scripture. Each page was an act of manifestation, every sentence a living declaration of what he had proven in experience. This is how faith takes form on paper. He understood that writing wasn't about explaining. It was about transferring states of consciousness through language. This is where the unseen dictates through intuition. Sometimes, entire passages would flow as if whispered by a higher awareness that used his pen as its vessel. This is how creation records itself. His first work spoke directly to those seeking evidence that thought alone could change reality. This is where structure yields to spirit. He wrote in rhythm with the pulse of revelation rather than the rules of literature. This is how simplicity conceals power. Every book he produced was brief but layered, meant to be read not with the intellect but with the feeling mind. This is where the reader becomes the co-creator. Neville reminded everyone that interpretation is creation, that the reader's belief completes the text's power. This is how imagination writes destiny twice, first in the unseen and again in ink. This is where timelessness reveals itself. Though written decades ago, his words still strike the present moment as if composed yesterday. This is how vibration travels beyond centuries. He often said that a book is a living imagination wrapped in paper, awakening only when believed. This is where conviction meets clarity. Each title, Feeling is the Secret, The Power of Awareness, Awakened Imagination, was not mere inspiration, but the proof of his method made permanent. This is how truth repeats itself in new language. Every story within his works points back to one unbreakable law: assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. This is where understanding blossoms into revelation. He didn't seek disciples but discoverers, urging readers to test every principle personally. This is how literature becomes initiation. To read Neville was to step into an experiment that rearranges the reader's world from within. This is where legacy is forged. His books outlived him because they were not opinions but instructions for divine self-realization. This is how words become worlds. Those who read with conviction often reported miracles unfolding before the final page. This is where the written becomes the witnessed. Through each published line, Neville extended his imagination into the consciousness of humanity. And this is how immortality quietly manifests. For as long as one person reads and believes, Neville Goddard continues to create through the very imagination he awakened in others. Think of the moment when a man once silent about his inner world now stands before an audience, the air charged with expectancy, and every listener leaning forward as if drawn by an invisible current of authority radiating from a truth already proven in his own life. This is how presence becomes persuasion. Neville didn't lecture from intellect, but from demonstration, speaking not of theories, but of lived miracles. This is where sound becomes substance. His words carried vibration that stirred something ancient within each listener, as if the soul recognized its own forgotten power. This is how performance becomes revelation. Each evening talk was not a speech, but an act of creation, with Neville imagining transformation for those before him. This is where consciousness touches the crowd. He visualized every seat filled, every heart awakened, and every skeptic silently convinced before he uttered a single word. This is how atmosphere creates outcome. The room itself seemed to vibrate with an unseen electricity that mirrored his inner certainty. This is where storytelling becomes alchemy. He told parables of ordinary people who used imagination to alter their fate, wrapping divine truth in relatable skin. This is how doubt dissolves through example. Listeners found themselves believing not because they were persuaded, but because something within them remembered. This is where rhythm and revelation intertwine. Neville spoke slowly, deliberately, letting each phrase breathe until it sank into the subconscious. This is how awareness expands through resonance. Even long after the lectures ended, people reported that his words continued to echo within them, producing change. This is where unseen audiences form. Recordings of his talks later traveled the world, igniting imaginations across decades and continents. This is how teaching becomes transmission. Neville's presence was less about instruction and more about imparting a vibration that aligned others with their creative power. This is where humility meets mastery. Though revered, he often reminded crowds that he was not special, only awake to what everyone already is. This is how conviction conquers resistance. When challenged by skeptics, he didn't debate. He simply invited them to test the law and watch results prove it. This is where silence becomes proof. Many who mocked him later returned transformed, quietly acknowledging that his words had altered the trajectory of their lives. This is how public spaces become sacred. Theaters turned into temples, stages into sanctuaries of awakening, and applause into affirmations of recognition. This is where language transcends limitation. Every talk carried both poetry and precision, a combination that spoke to intellect and intuition alike. This is how legacy multiplies through voice. Those who attended his lectures became messengers themselves, spreading the principles to homes, schools, and spiritual circles. This is where creation meets communication. Each lecture was an imaginal act, with Neville seeing his audience as already empowered beings, and Hing. This is how teaching becomes eternal. Though his physical voice is long gone, the recordings and recollections continue to speak, proving that the word once imagined can never die. Ask yourself what happens when a man who once struggled to make ends meet begins to see money not as currency, but as condensed imagination, realizing that wealth is simply awareness clothed in form, responding to the tone of belief that he carries within him every waking moment. This is how perception becomes prosperity. Neville understood that lack was not a financial condition, but a state of consciousness, one that could be rewritten by assuming the feeling of already being provided for. This is where invisible abundance begins to flow. He would sit quietly in the evening, imagining checks arriving, bills already paid, and gratitude overflowing for unseen supply. This is how feeling writes the future. To him, the act of imagining money was not fantasy, but the recognition that consciousness itself is substance. This is where the law of sufficiency reveals itself. The outer world had no choice but to conform to his new inner assumption of endless provision. This is how the unseen rearranges the scene. Unexpected opportunities appeared. Book contracts, lectures, patrons, each arriving precisely when he felt richest within. This is where the illusion of work dissolves. Neville taught that it is not effort but consciousness that multiplies results, effort being only the shadow of an inner certainty. This is how gratitude magnetizes gain. He practiced thanksgiving before evidence, celebrating the unseen with the same joy as the manifested. This is where true security hides. No bank, no economy, no external condition could define his wealth, for his supply was drawn directly from imagination itself. This is how alignment overcomes anxiety. When others feared shortage, Neville rested in the assurance that his inner world was always self-sustaining. This is where joy becomes a signal. He discovered that genuine delight in the idea of wealth attracts more of its kind, echoing through the unseen like a psalm that calls its own chorus. This is how identity becomes income. He shifted from thinking of himself as one who earns money to one through whom wealth naturally flows. This is where simplicity proves supreme. His technique never changed. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled and let the bridge of incidents unfold. This is how delay turns into delivery. Even apparent setbacks became setups, each aligning perfectly with his state of abundance. This is where divine timing governs results. He learned to rest between imagination and manifestation, knowing that creation is finished and unfolding in perfect order. This is how the law of assumption demonstrates fairness. Wealth came not through favoritism but through consciousness. What you assume, you experience. This is where awareness becomes the only asset. Neville taught that a poor man who knows this truth is wealthier than a rich man who believes only in effort. This is how independence becomes effortless. His finances stabilized without obsession because he stopped working for money and began creating from wealth. This is where proof transforms into principle. Every deposit, every opportunity, every blessing became evidence that imagination governs economics. And this is how legacy enriches eternity. Neville's own prosperity story now stands as a timeless reminder that abundance is never earned. It is assumed, felt, and inevitably revealed. Consider the possibility that every person who enters your life is not a random encounter but a reflection of your state of consciousness, appearing precisely when your inner dialogue calls them into form. And that Neville Goddard's relationships were living proof of this unseen correspondence between feeling and form. This is how connection transcends coincidence. He taught that others are mirrors, revealing who we believe ourselves to be, not who they are independently. This is where understanding becomes intimacy. Neville realized that love, friendship, and reconciliation all begin in imagination, long before they appear in flesh. This is how the unseen weaves hearts together. When he longed for companionship or reconciliation, he would imagine conversations already healed and laughter already shared. This is where distance dissolves in consciousness. Even those separated by miles responded inwardly, drawn by the magnetic tone of his assumption. This is how forgiveness becomes freedom. Neville stopped seeing others as wrongdoers, and instead revised the scenes of conflict until harmony felt natural. This is where revision reshapes reality. He would go back in imagination, reliving a moment differently until the new version replaced the old in emotional truth. This is how the past obeys the present mind. Soon, people began reaching out with kindness or apologies, unaware that the change had occurred first in Neville's inner movie. This is where imagination becomes empathy. He learned to treat others as extensions of self, recognizing that to lift another is to elevate one's own consciousness. This is how energy speaks louder than words. When Neville entered a room, people felt calm, open, and inspired because his assumption of goodwill preceded him. This is where loneliness loses its illusion. He taught that love cannot be found externally. It must be assumed internally until it draws its reflection. This is how companionship manifests naturally. When Neville desired union, he imagined himself already married, already cherished, until life arranged the meeting without effort. This is where self-love becomes magnetism. He discovered that to be loved, one must first feel lovable and live from that emotional state. This is how invisible affection turns visible. The warmth cultivated in imagination spilled effortlessly into his outer world. This is where divine relationships unfold. Every bond he formed was rooted not in need, but in shared awareness of divine unity. This is how misunderstanding transforms into understanding. When others resisted or disagreed, he silently blessed them, knowing that harmony in mind precedes harmony in matter. This is where partnership becomes purpose. His marriage later in life mirrored his own inner wholeness. a union between human and divine awareness. This is how emotional maturity reveals power. Neville proved that no heartache is permanent if imagination is used to rewrite its meaning. This is where love transcends personality. By seeing everyone as the embodiment of God in expression, he dissolved separation and conflict, and subsuper. This is how human connection becomes sacred. Through Neville's life, we learn that to manifest love is to remember that consciousness alone builds, sustains, and redeems every relationship. Envision a world where the accumulation of wealth, relationships, and influence is only a prelude to the deeper revelation that the true treasure lies within, and that Neville Goddard's ultimate manifestations were not things but consciousness itself, fully awakened to its divine nature. This is how inner truth eclipses outer spectacle. Neville came to see that every external success was merely a reflection of his spiritual alignment. This is where realization becomes liberation. The feeling of God within replaced the need for validation from the world. This is how identity transcends form. He understood that the I he had cultivated through imagination was not personal ego, but universal selfhood. This is where perception aligns with reality. By living in this awareness, he found that circumstances no longer dictated mood, fortune, or direction. This is how the eternal manifests in the temporal. Spiritual insight gave him access to states of joy, peace, and creative potency that no external event could alter. This is where consciousness alone holds dominion. Neville demonstrated that the divine is not distant, but present, waiting for recognition through assumption. This is how belief becomes revelation. When he imagined God as present in every act, the miraculous became mundane and effortless. This is where awakening transforms action. He no longer sought guidance outside because he realized imagination was the channel through which divine will flows. This is how mastery of self manifests mastery of life. Spiritual practice became his currency, inner alignment his wealth. This is where the invisible becomes palpable. Meditation, prayer, and visualization coalesced into living proof that thought shapes substance. This is how certainty silences fear. He discovered that acknowledging the divine in every circumstance dissolves doubt instantly. This is where awareness becomes omnipotence. By feeling God within, he found that creation obeys the mind that consciously knows itself as infinite. This is how the mind inhabits eternity. Time and space became secondary, as he operated from a state beyond limitation. This is where fear turns to freedom. He no longer reacted to events but imagined outcomes, feeling them complete before evidence arrived. This is how the soul expands through practice. Every moment of inner discipline became an exercise in manifesting divine possibility. This is where the invisible bridges to the visible. Every life circumstance, once uncertain, now obeyed the laws he consciously understood. This is how spiritual wealth exceeds material gain. Inner riches created a world where desire was always satisfied. This is where knowing becomes doing. Neville's realization of God in himself became the blueprint for all manifestations that followed. And this is how ultimate power is revealed. The highest manifestation is not a thing obtained, but the awakening to the infinite, the recognition that consciousness alone creates and sustains all reality. Picture for a moment Neville sitting quietly, eyes closed, not wishing for the world to change but feeling with absolute certainty that the world already reflected his inner vision, and that this practice of living in the end would become the cornerstone of his manifestations. This is how imagination becomes architecture. He rehearsed every desired outcome as if it were already accomplished, and this is where feeling eclipses thought. The intensity of sensation mattered more than the clarity of visual detail. This is how inner rehearsal dictates outer reality. He would replay scenes repeatedly until the mind accepted them as fact. This is where consistency becomes magnetism. Repetition of imagined experiences strengthened the neural pathways that transformed possibility into inevitability. This is how the senses obey the mind. He trained himself to feel wealth, love, health, and success as tangible presences. This is where the law of assumption proves itself. By assuming the end, Neville invited the external world to mirror his inner certainty. This is how time bends to imagination. He would visualize not only events, but the sequence and timing of outcomes as though arranging a personal film. This is where emotion becomes gravity. The feeling of fulfillment pulled circumstances toward him with effortless force. This is how attention becomes action. He discovered that sustained focus on an imagined reality moves people, events, and objects to align. This is where revision reshapes history. Neville taught that reliving and altering past experiences in imagination can change present perception and future outcome. This is how subtlety reveals power. Even fleeting visualizations imbued with emotion left lasting imprints on consciousness. This is where discipline becomes delight. He approached imagination not as a chore, but as a sacred practice of co-creation. This is how patience and persistence intertwine. Repeated mental living guaranteed that no matter how long manifestation took, it was inevitable. This is where consciousness dictates circumstance. He demonstrated that inner acceptance of a fulfilled state is stronger than any external obstacle. This is how belief solidifies into reality. Doubt was systematically replaced with the absolute assumption of success. This is where focus becomes the sculptor. The mind shapes the world exactly as attention directs it. This is how imagination becomes inheritance. Neville left detailed exercises so that anyone could employ these methods to manifest life consciously. This is where mastery lives in practice. Consistent application of these techniques ensures that reality bends to the state assumed, and this is how creation becomes habitual. Through daily visualization, Neville proved that a disciplined imagination is the most potent tool a human possesses. Can you imagine a man who understood that the body is only a reflection of consciousness, and that vitality and healing could be imagined into existence just as surely as wealth or success, and that Neville Goddard applied the same principles of assumption to his physical well-being? This is how the mind becomes medicine. He treated health not as a condition to be cured, but as a state to be assumed. This is where visualization reshapes biology. He would vividly feel his body strong, energized, and perfectly balanced. This is how belief overrides limitation. Any symptoms or weakness were met with the certainty of inner perfection. This is where the senses obey imagination. He felt blood circulating, cells regenerating, and vitality flowing as though already realized. This is how the unseen supports the seen. Before consulting doctors or treatments, Neville first brought his consciousness into alignment with optimal health. This is where focus heals. By giving attention to life rather than illness, he shifted energy toward regeneration and strength. This is how assumption replaces worry. He refused to dwell on discomfort, instead imagining the body as whole and resilient. This is where the law of cause becomes evident. The physical world responded consistently to the inner state he cultivated. This is how discipline shapes well-being. Daily imagination sessions became a ritual, reinforcing health at every level. This is where the inner and outer converge. The moment he felt robust internally, the body naturally followed. This is how energy becomes remedy. Vitality was drawn from the imagination itself, flowing into tissues and systems as living proof of consciousness. This is where perception dictates experience. He never identified with sickness, knowing that feeling ill is merely agreeing with a false scene. This is how patience accompanies faith. Physical results unfolded naturally when inner conviction remained unwavering. This is where consciousness defines biology. Every mental rehearsal of health left a permanent imprint on the physical self. This is how the invisible works through the tangible. Friends and students often noticed his vigor and endurance as a natural outcome of his practice. This is where visualization empowers self-mastery. Health became not something to attain, but something already possessed in imagination. This is how mind and body harmonize. The principles he taught for wealth, love, and purpose applied seamlessly to vitality, and this is how life becomes a demonstration. Neville's example proves that when imagination is disciplined with feeling, the body obeys, responding as faithfully as any other aspect of reality to the law of assumption. Ask yourself what happens when every obstacle you face is not a barrier, but a rehearsal for mastery. And that Neville Goddard treated challenges not as setbacks, but as opportunities to deepen his understanding and application of the law of assumption. This is how adversity becomes instruction. When difficulties appeared, he first imagined the resolution fully accomplished, feeling the relief and triumph as though already real. This is where inner resolve outmatches circumstance. He refused to let external chaos dictate his emotional or mental state. This is how the mind bends reality. Every problem he faced was met with a calm assumption that the solution existed and was already in motion. This is where fear dissolves. He replaced worry with vivid inner scenes of victory. This is how patience becomes power. Delays and obstacles were never resistance, but signals to hold the feeling of fulfillment longer. This is where persistence manifests. Repeated mental rehearsal ensured that the universe responded in alignment with his unwavering state. This is how clarity becomes strategy. He could see the path to resolution in imagination before it materialized in the world. This is where revision heals. When mistakes or conflicts arose, he would mentally rewrite the events, experiencing the ideal outcome until it became inevitable. This is how inner authority directs outer circumstance. Neville understood that outer problems obeyed the state of consciousness more than the laws of chance. This is where humility strengthens mastery. He acknowledged challenges as teachers, allowing the lessons to embed deeply into his awareness. This is how resilience is cultivated. By remaining unshaken in imagination, he proved that no event could overpower the assumption of the end. This is where focus transforms struggle. Every act of concentration on a resolved state drew solutions, people, and opportunities toward him. This is how the invisible scaffolds the visible. The world seemed to bend around his steadfast assumption, opening doors without force. This is where doubt meets evidence. Repeated victories over obstacles reinforced the principle that imagination is the ultimate cause. This is how energy redirects fate. Moments of crisis became catalysts for deeper mastery. This is where emotional mastery becomes freedom. Neville's inner calm allowed him to navigate turbulence without panic. This is how belief becomes armor. Certainty protected him from the contagion of fear and despair. This is where vision exceeds circumstance. No setback could delay a man who had already assumed the outcome, an Amberhen. This is how challenge is the proving ground. Each obstacle he overcame became evidence that the inner world shapes the outer, leaving an indelible lesson for all who would follow. Envision a moment when a man's work, once unseen and unheard, begins to resonate across rooms, cities, and eventually continents, as if the universe itself conspired to acknowledge what had already been realized in his mind. This is how influence manifests. Neville did not chase fame or approval. He assumed the recognition of his insights as already belonging to him. This is where inner certainty calls outer validation. Publishers, students, and audiences appeared naturally, drawn to the vibration of someone confident in unseen authority. This is how the law of assumption governs reputation. The world cannot deny what consciousness has already accepted as true. This is where demonstration replaces persuasion. Rather than convincing anyone, Neville simply embodied the state of a recognized teacher, and recognition flowed as a natural consequence. This is how preparation meets opportunity. Every lecture, book, and conversation was preceded by vivid imagination of acclaim and attention. This is where alignment reveals power. Those who would support, learn, and promote his work were drawn into his orbit effortlessly. This is how visibility arises from inner state. He understood that acknowledgement is not earned externally, but radiates from inner conviction. This is where subtlety amplifies impact. Neville's calm confidence magnetized curiosity and respect without the need for overt self-promotion. This is how persistence in thought secures results. Continual mental rehearsal of influence ensured that doors opened when the timing was right. This is where belief surpasses ego. He did not seek applause for validation, but as a natural reflection of the state he assumed within. This is how inner reality creates outer prestige. By feeling himself already recognized, the world mirrored that assumption. This is where clarity becomes authority. Audiences sensed authenticity and were drawn to the power of someone who lived his teachings. This is how imagination accelerates opportunity. Meetings, invitations, and collaborations appeared as if predestined. This is where the invisible scaffolds social proof. Neville's confidence became contagious, inspiring others to acknowledge his insights and share them widely. This is where humility coexists with influence. He remained grounded, knowing that recognition is a mirror, not the source. This is how timing obeys inner law. Every acknowledgement arrived precisely when his state of readiness aligned with outer events. This is where demonstration outweighs explanation. The proof of his principles was in the tangible effect on others. This is how mastery radiates outward, his influence multiplied through students, readers, and audiences without conscious effort. And this is how recognition becomes a tool for teaching. Every acknowledgement served to extend his work, ensuring that the law he demonstrated reached far beyond his immediate sphere. Now consider this. A man who had mastered the unseen began each day not with errands or to-do lists, but with deliberate inner exercises that aligned every thought, feeling, and attention with the reality he desired, proving that daily practice is the engine of manifestation. This is how routine shapes destiny. Neville would awaken and immediately enter a state of assumption, rehearsing the life he wished to live as though it were already complete. This is where focus becomes creation. Every imagined scene was imbued with vivid detail and intense feeling. This is how discipline transforms imagination into results. He consistently spent time revisiting scenes of success, wealth, health, and harmonious relationships. This is where energy is multiplied. By repeating these mental rehearsals, he built momentum that moved circumstances toward fulfillment. This is how the subconscious becomes obedient. Nightly visualization before sleep allowed impressions to sink deeply, influencing the external world while consciousness rested. This is where attention rules experience. He avoided feeding doubt, fear, or anxiety, knowing that even a fleeting mental agreement with negativity could delay manifestation. This is how consistency fuels inevitability. Daily repetition of these practices strengthened his mastery over cause and effect. This is where imagination becomes habit. Neville made the exercise of inner creation as routine as brushing teeth or preparing for the day. This is how alignment produces effortless results. Because he practiced so consistently, opportunities seemed to appear without effort or planning. This is where inner reality dictates outer reality. The more he lived mentally in the end state, the more tangible evidence followed. This is how patience meets power. He allowed time for manifestation while remaining unwavering in feeling. This is where clarity sharpens intention. Each session was focused on a single outcome, preventing scattered energy from diluting results. This is where repetition engraves certainty. By rehearsing his dreams repeatedly, he removed uncertainty from the process entirely. This is how preparation meets opportunity. He was always mentally and emotionally ready for any circumstance to conform to his assumptions. This is where self-mastery equals world mastery. Controlling the inner world guaranteed control over the outer. This is how consciousness becomes a magnet. Every practice increased his ability to draw people, events, and resources in alignment with vision. This is where imagination becomes second nature. Repetition made it effortless to enter the state of fulfillment at will. This is how momentum carries manifestation, one mental victory compounded into the next, and bam. This is how disciplined mental practice becomes unstoppable. By daily living in assumption, Neville proved that mastery is not an event but a continuous, cultivated state of being. Envision a night where every event, every interaction, every moment of the day is not left to memory, but carefully rewoven in imagination. And that Neville Goddard used this practice to rewrite reality itself before sleep. This is how the past becomes malleable. He would revisit each scene, altering outcomes in his mind to reflect the state of fulfillment he desired. This is where memory serves creation. Mistakes, conflicts, or missed opportunities were transformed into perfect scenarios in imagination. This is how emotional revision reshapes the future. By feeling the ideal outcome as real, he impressed new possibilities upon his subconscious. This is where the unseen rewrites history. Past discomforts lost their power, replaced by mental images of resolution and harmony. This is how consciousness corrects circumstance. Any negative experience that could have lingered was dissolved before the day ended. This is where clarity sharpens reality, by focusing on exactly what he wanted instead of what happened. Neville directed energy toward alignment. This is how assumption consolidates power. Each evening's revision reinforced the belief that the world conforms to the inner state. This is where the mind becomes the sculptor. He molded events like clay, turning every encounter into a rehearsal of the desired end. This is how gratitude amplifies creation. Even imagined outcomes were embraced with joy, amplifying their magnetic effect. This is where mastery over time emerges. Yesterday's events became tools for today's manifestations. This is how subtlety influences matter. Tiny mental adjustments produced shifts in perception and opportunity that manifested externally. This is where discipline meets imagination. Nightly practice ensured that no event, however small, was left unaligned. This is how revision dissolves limitation. By mentally correcting scenarios, he removed internal resistance that could hinder progress. This is where control of consciousness equals control of life. The outer world became increasingly responsive to his inner certainty. This is how habitual revision secures results. Repeated nightly practice ingrained a subconscious expectation of perfection. This is where the mind silently governs circumstance. As he slept, the unseen world aligned with the revised scenarios. This is how revision fuels momentum. Each perfect mental ending compounded into greater manifestations, and this is how daily correction becomes unstoppable. Neville's evening technique ensured that every day contributed to the continuous unfolding of his conscious creation. Think of the moment when one awakened consciousness begins to illuminate countless others, and Neville Goddard transformed his personal mastery into a living curriculum for students eager to experience the same creative power. This is how teaching becomes transmission. He didn't merely lecture or write. He guided students to feel their desired realities as already true. This is where demonstration eclipses explanation. His presence alone conveyed the law of assumption more powerfully than words. This is how subtle instruction shapes destiny. He would ask students to close their eyes, imagine the end, and live in that state until it became unquestionable. This is where trust becomes practice. He taught that persistence in feeling outweighs all external evidence. This is how mastery multiplies. Every student who applied his methods became a living proof of the principles he shared. This is where imagination becomes community. Small groups practicing together amplified the power of assumption, reinforcing belief through shared experience. This is how feedback shapes reality. He encouraged students to report outcomes, reinforcing the tangible effects of inner alignment. This is where authority is silent. Neville never imposed belief, only offered demonstration and guidance. This is how clarity fosters independence. Students were taught to experiment personally, discovering that consciousness governs all outcomes. This is where repetition ingrains truth. Daily exercises, mental rehearsals, and revision became rituals under his mentorship. This is how empowerment spreads. Each student carried the knowledge outward, creating a ripple effect of manifestation. This is where alignment begets influence. As his followers practiced, their lives reflected the same abundance, love, and freedom Neville modeled. This is how subtle energy teaches. He emphasized that states of feeling, not intellectual understanding, transform lives. This is where persistence cements results. He reminded students that even small daily acts of assumption accumulate into extraordinary change. This is how belief transforms culture. Each success story reinforced the invisible law, inspiring others to test it. This is where inner authority becomes contagious. Students absorbed his confidence, becoming magnets for their own desired experiences. This is how imagination becomes inheritance. Neville's methods provided tools for lifelong creation. This is where legacy grows. The principles he imparted multiplied as students taught others. And this is how consciousness shapes generations. Through dedicated guidance, Neville ensured that the law of assumption continues to awaken minds and manifest realities across time. Envision a life where every moment, every manifestation, and every encounter is embraced with deep appreciation, and that Neville Goddard understood gratitude not as a polite sentiment, but as a creative force that amplifies manifestation. This is how feeling shapes reality. He taught that the act of giving thanks generates a vibration that attracts more of what is acknowledged. This is where acknowledgement becomes magnetism. By celebrating unseen blessings, he strengthened their eventual physical expression. This is how awareness multiplies outcomes. Neville would feel grateful for opportunities, relationships, and abundance before they appeared. This is where emotion becomes cause. The sincerity of his gratitude sent ripples through consciousness that the world could not resist. This is how alignment heightens reception. Gratitude refined his inner state, making it receptive to more fulfillment. This is where perception directs power. By focusing on what was already perfect or desired, he ensured the universe responded in kind. This is how joy precedes form. The inner delight in imagined outcomes accelerated their manifestation externally. This is where the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Small details, unnoticed by many, were celebrated by Neville, enhancing their creative potential. This is how consistency engraves influence. Habitual appreciation built a persistent mental climate favorable to all his assumptions. This is where trust deepens. Gratitude reinforced his certainty that life would always provide exactly what was aligned with his inner state. This is how energy expands. Each thankful thought radiated outward, touching events, people, and circumstances. This is where humility blends with power. He recognized that all manifestations were responses to consciousness, not personal effort. This is how consciousness cultivates abundance. Grateful awareness became the fertile soil for every dream he had imagined. This is where refinement sharpens manifestation. By maintaining appreciation, even in challenging moments, he prevented resistance from taking hold. This is how inner tone guides outer experience. The frequency of gratitude shaped the unfolding of reality with precision. This is where persistence compounds effect. Daily expressions of thankfulness created an unstoppable momentum. This is how manifestation becomes effortless. The universe flowed naturally in response to the vibrational signature of appreciation. This is where life itself mirrors feeling. Every fulfilled desire became a reflection of the gratitude Neville cultivated first internally and end. This is how creative living becomes complete. Through consistent, heartfelt appreciation, he demonstrated that gratitude is not only a reaction to reality, but the engine that powers its continuous manifestation. Envision a world decades after Neville Goddard walked the earth, where his words, recordings, and teachings continue to awaken consciousness across continents, generations, and cultures, proving that the law he demonstrated transcends time and circumstance. This is how influence outlives the body. His books and lectures became living instruments, activating the imaginations of those who sought transformation. This is where teaching becomes timeless. Students who embraced his methods continue to create lives aligned with their deepest desires. This is how principles multiply. Each person who applies the law of assumption becomes a living testament to his legacy. This is where inspiration spreads like wildfire. Online communities, study groups, and courses carry his vision into realms he never physically entered. This is how proof perpetuates itself. Countless testimonials confirm that imagination, disciplined with feeling, still manifests reality as Neville described. This is where authority survives absence. Though he is no longer physically present, his voice resonates through recordings and writings, guiding new generations. This is how legacy becomes participatory. Anyone willing to test the principles becomes a co-creator in the ongoing story of manifestation. This is where influence transcends medium. Words on a page, spoken lectures, and personal practice continue to expand consciousness worldwide. This is how unseen law demonstrates omnipresence. The principles he taught operate everywhere, beyond culture, language, or circumstance. This is where empowerment multiplies. His teachings encourage independence, inviting students to experiment and discover their own creative power. This is how consciousness shapes civilization. Communities of practitioners embodying these laws shift collective awareness over time. This is where faith becomes action. Neville's legacy is validated by the tangible transformations of countless lives. This is how imagination becomes inheritance. His work provides practical tools for anyone to reshape reality. This is where demonstration equals authority. The proof of his principles lies in the lived experiences of those who apply them. This is how inspiration outpaces mortality. He remains present in every mind awakened to the law of assumption. This is where vision transcends individual life. His teachings invite humanity to recognize its own divine potential. This is how continuity manifests. Through repeated application, the principles continue to ripple across time. This is where his work becomes a movement. Neville's influence endures as both methodology and philosophy, and this is how creation itself remembers him. His life exemplifies that when consciousness is understood and applied, it writes a legacy far beyond the temporal. Envision the totality of a life lived in conscious creation, where every thought, feeling, and assumption Neville Goddard held became the blueprint for a world he shaped without force, demonstrating that the power of imagination governs every facet of reality. This is how mastery integrates all aspects. Wealth, health, love, recognition, and spiritual awakening were not separate pursuits, but expressions of the same underlying law. This is where discipline meets genius. Through daily practice, revision, and visualization, Neville aligned every moment with his desired state. This is how imagination organizes life. He treated each day as a canvas, carefully painting outcomes before they manifested externally. This is where consciousness dictates circumstance. The world responded faithfully to the inner reality he assumed. This is how awareness becomes omnipotent. By inhabiting the end in feeling, he transformed obstacles into opportunities and scarcity into abundance. This is where the invisible becomes visible. Every manifestation was the natural reflection of an unwavering inner state. This is how practice cements principle. Nightly revision, morning assumption, and persistent visualization created unstoppable momentum. This is where emotion serves as power. Gratitude, joy, and certainty were not incidental, but the engines driving each result. This is how relationships mirror inner states. Harmony, connection, and love appeared when imagined and felt as real. This is where teaching multiplies influence. Students and readers extended his consciousness, becoming living proof of the law. This is how health aligns with thought. Vitality and well-being manifested effortlessly when assumed and felt as present. This is where recognition follows alignment, acknowledgement, influence, and respect arrived naturally when he occupied the state of mastery. This is how adversity becomes opportunity. Every challenge was a rehearsal for greater manifestation, reinforcing the law of assumption. This is where spiritual realization anchors all. The understanding of God within unified his practice, making all external results a mirror of inner divinity. This is how imagination transcends time. His books, lectures, and recordings continue to awaken minds, creating ripples of manifestation long after his physical life. This is where legacy becomes living. Every student, practitioner, and believer carries forward the principles he embodied. This is how creation is effortless when aligned. Consciousness governs form, matter, and circumstance with precision. This is where the complete picture reveals itself. Neville's life demonstrates that mastery of imagination is mastery of reality itself, and this is how the story culminates. Every aspect of his manifestations, from wealth to relationships, health to spiritual awakening, intertwines into a singular truth, that when consciousness is fully assumed, life itself becomes the proof of its infinite creative power.